All right.
So while Bill's setting that up, I'll introduce him. Most of you know Bill, of course, as the one of the founders of Equinix, which is a colocation exchange company. And of course, before that, Bill's previous life, he was the chair of NANOG and was most famous for the wonderful jokes that he would tell. And if we're lucky, he'll tell us one today, too. He's going to talk more about the economic side of peering, especially in the U.S. And one of the questions that as a content provider I always have to ask myself and people around me is, would it make sense for us to peer? Does it make more sense for us to just keep buying transit? What's the climate like? Would anybody peer with me? Things like that. And Bill maybe can answer some of these questions after his joke. So, Bill.
Is there a question already from the audience?
I have a question regarding internet peering. Internet peering, the network frontier. This was your 5-year mission, to study peering ecosystems throughout the planet, to meet peering coordinators and help them build a civilized community, to research, to document their motivations, their strategies, their behaviors, to travel on my dime, enjoying many fine lunches and dinners, and to boldly go and document internet operations where no man had done before.
The reason I put these slides together, actually there were 3 reasons. The first is, as many of you Star Trek fans know, Starfleet Academy is based here in San Francisco. You remember that from, I think, Search for Spock, maybe? The second reason is I know a lot of you had a late night last night in the holodeck, had many garlic dishes, much Romulan ale, and afterwards some gawk. But really, to point out that the peering community, about 15% of you folks I classify as being in the peering community. I went through and checked names of folks who I work with on more or less a daily or weekly basis. And the peering community is really kind of a close-knit community. A lot of these folks know each other. They work in different companies, but they work very closely with each other. And it's when things break in the middle of the night that you really need to know who the other person is in the other organization that you can contact to get things fixed. So my 5-year mission has actually been to work very closely with the peering coordinator community. I describe myself as being an internet researcher because I'm 90% externally focused, working very closely with the peering coordinators to find out what are the peering practices, what are the definitions. And what I do is I write these research documents, these white papers on peering, that basically go through this process. I'll find an interesting operations topic by talking with Ren or Joe or Brokaw or one of the guys that is of interest to peering coordinators, and I'll ask them, how does this stuff work? What are the definitions? And I'll write down what they say and walk peering coordinators through the results of that first white paper. And people will change things and say, no, it doesn't work like that, or you have to modify this. And I'll evolve this paper and eventually, as I'll do today, share the information with a broader conference type of environment. So far, there are about 8 peering papers that are publicly available. These are all freely available. You can send email to me if you like, or you can find them. If you search for William B. Norton on the web, these will pop up on a bunch of different places. The one I'm going to talk about today is called The Evolution of the U.S. Peering Ecosystem. And for this white paper, I asked the question, how has peering changed since the telecom crash around 2000 or 2001? Secondarily, I started getting a number of our potential customers from overseas coming in and saying, hey, Bill, I'd love to come into your exchange point if you can get me peering with all the tier 1s in the U.S. To which I had to explain, well, you know, that's not exactly how it works. So this paper also doubles to describe how it actually does work. And what I'm really shooting here for is to identify the players, the motivations that can help us predict the behaviors of the various players in the peering ecosystem. So let me start out with a couple of basic definitions. The first, of course, is the Internet is a network of networks. And I tend to think of these networks of networks as being broken down into this global peering ecosystem that consists of individual Internet regions. And when I say Internet region today, you can just think of country. Just substitute country wherever I say Internet region and you'll about have it. Within each of these Internet regions, what we tend to see are three rough classifications of providers, of players, each with their own position in the ecosystem, each with their own motivations. And again, these motivations are important because they can help us predict the behavior in the peering ecosystem. And these three rough categories are Tier 1 ISPs, Tier 2 ISPs, and content players. And before you guys get the arrows out and start shooting me, I want to make a very strong point here that I am reclaiming the phrase Tier 1 ISP with a very specific definition. And I'm going to describe each of these players in terms of an organism. Again, the Star Trek theme here. So we're kind of viewing these things from afar. What does it look like from the outside? So we have Tier 1 ISPs that, by definition, are ISPs that have access to the entire Internet region solely through peering relationships. That is, they do not buy transit from anybody to reach routes, destinations within that particular Internet region. So I draw these Tier 1 ISPs as having downstream links. These are transit connections, what they sell to their customers, and then peering links off to the side there. So because these guys don't buy transit from anybody, they have a motivation in the peering ecosystem that, hey, we have all the peering that we need. We don't need any more peers. And that, for that reason, we see, and in the paper I go into this a little bit more, there's a peering inclination that I would describe as restrictive. A restrictive peering policy, a restrictive inclination, basically is we don't want to peer with anybody else. It's a little bit controversial, but in a nutshell, that's what it tends to be. Also in the US, what you see is 8 interconnection regions where the Tier 1 ISPs interconnect with each other, roughly shown on the map in the lower right-hand corner. Interesting, in this ecosystem, you do tend to see roughly a full mesh of peering in each one of those interconnect regions. So who are these two Tier 2 ISPs? Well, again, by my definitions, everybody else is a Tier 2 ISP. So if you have to buy transit, then you're a Tier 2 ISP by my definition. And again, why are these definitions important? Why are these classifications important? And the reason is that it goes to the motivations and the behaviors as seen from the outside of these players. The upstreams are shown as lines going up to the top, typically up to a Tier 1 ISP or perhaps another Tier 2 ISP. And the motivation here is to peer for two reasons, basically, from what I've seen in the research. First is to reduce costs. Traffic you send across free peering infrastructure is traffic you don't have to pay for up to your transit providers upstream. And the inclination tends to reflect that also. With the Tier 2 ISPs, you'll see a range of peering inclinations from being open, also known by Brokaw, I think, calls it pulse peering. We'll peer with you if you have a pulse. To selective, where there might be some prerequisites that are ultimately reachable, 5 megabits per second on each coast, for example, and then we will peer with you. And I say sparse peering because what you see a lot of is the Tier 2 ISPs tend to be in 1 or 2 of the interconnect regions. Few of them tend to be in many of them. So in terms of the interconnection, you don't tend to see a full mesh. And plus this selective notion makes it so that some people do not peer with each other. And then finally, the third character in the third organism in the ecosystem is a content provider, which looks, again, similar, but only with the upstream connections. Again, we're talking about 1998 here, so this is the beginning. We're going to talk about an evolution, so this is where we started in 1998. And the content providers typically did not peer at all. They hold on to that SLA from their upstream, and their primary focus was really creating and delivering the content. So, this was the pre-crash, around 1998. as groups of these individual organisms in the ecosystem, I roughly categorize them and describe them as shown in this diagram here. Where up at the top of the hierarchy you have the Tier 1 ISPs who don't have to buy transit from anybody to reach that region and sell to both the content providers as well as the Tier 2 ISPs below. And again, up in that Tier 1 mesh, you have 8 interconnection regions where you typically see full mesh peering. In the Tier 2 space, you see more sparse peering and more regional peering. And then down in the content space, you see pretty much no peering. Remember 1998? Transit, $388 or so, roughly speaking, per meg. Higher than that? What was the number? $700-800 per meg? Time was good, right? And then the crash. No, not that type of crash. The telecom industry crash, roughly I see it as around 1999 to 2001. And again, from talking to the peering coordinators for this talk and this research, there really seem to be 5 very strong disruptions that led to 3 evolutions in the peering ecosystem as I described. The first were the Tier 1 bankruptcies that really shook the core of the internet. After all, back in those days, you would count on UUNet as always being 701 and always being there and strong and such. But maybe even more importantly was when these Tier 1 guys went bankrupt, a lot of the Tier 2 guys went bankrupt at the same time, flooding the used equipment market. I remember Dan Golding told me once he populated an entire lab at his job at the time with used 7500s for like 20% of the price that he would buy, and these things would come shrink wrapped. They're brand new boxes. So the used equipment market flooded the environment. AtHome went bankrupt as well. And this led the cable companies to have to scramble to put in place infrastructure to handle the fallout. So they would buy transit from typically 2 Tier 1 ISPs. At the same time, we saw this exponential growth of this Kazaa peer-to-peer file stuff. When I spoke with Joe Klein from Adelphia, he shared that about 40% of the cable company traffic was ultimately destined to other eyeballs, so other cable companies, other Tier 2 ISPs. Yet these guys were, at the time, solely buying transit from their upstreams. And then finally, with the transit prices dropping dramatically, at the same time, the transport prices dropped dramatically. So these 5 disruptions in the ecosystem really led to the creation of this new organism in the peering ecosystem, the cable companies. These guys came into peering in a very big way. We're talking about between 3 and 5 gigabits per second of upstream transit, and 40% of that ultimately is or could be destined to the other peers, the other cable companies, the other Tier 2 ISPs. Now, when I wrote the white paper called Interconnection Strategies for ISPs and Internet Service Providers and Peering, there was a break-even point typically where peering made sense around 5 to 10 megabits per second. And these guys could peer 40% of, let's say, 5 gigabits per second. That's 2 gigabits per second that they would not have to pay for, that they could send directly to the other cable companies. This is huge. So what we see in the cable companies, though, is they don't tend to go after the commercial market and sell transit. So that's why you don't see the transit links down beneath this particular critter. The motivation for the cable companies, from what I've seen, is to save money, to reduce that load, but also to improve the performance for the customers. In terms of inclination, the peering inclination, largely for this huge amount of traffic, was open, although it shifted a little bit recently. And in terms of the peering, it does tend to be sparse depending on what regions the cable companies cover in terms of their home markets. And just to give you some numbers, some ideas of how huge this is, around 2002 when I did this research, and the numbers are much bigger now, I'm told, but we're talking about 12 million eyeballs. I guess 24 million if you count them both. And the other notable thing about the cable companies is that there was an 800-pound gorilla among the group, and that was AOL, where you'd see 3 to 5 gigabits per second roughly with most of the cable companies. AOL was way off the charts at the time, maybe 12 gigabits per second of traffic. And again, I understand the numbers are much higher. But it is notable that there is one very, very large group there. So again, the first evolution in the ecosystem as a result of those 5 disruptions is that the cable companies get into peering in a very, very big way. This is significant because of the traffic volume and because at the time the cable companies were openly peering with anybody and everybody. And again, the Kazaa effect was noted to me by Eric Troyer, where he said, you know, once you set up peering between 2 companies, you expect a certain amount of traffic to go between those 2 companies based upon your analysis, and it consistently seems to be 15 to 25% higher. And the theory was that more traffic is preferring the path across the peering connection because it's lower latency. So in the old world where it would go up a transit pipe and then back down, you'd have a worse performing path, and Kazaa would prefer now the peering path. So you get more traffic across your peering links than before. The second evolution has to do with some very large-scale, network-savvy content providers. And to give you some names, these are the Microsofts and the Yahoos of the world, the Googles, the Electronic Arts, and folks like that, that have decided that they can build out some peering infrastructure and get better performance and also reduce their costs. I think round numbers, I heard at conference in Singapore, the Yahoo is getting down with a blended transit and peering cost down into the single digits in terms of megabits per second, dollars per megabit per second. So what's interesting about these guys is that it wasn't so much the financial motivation as it was to improve the end user experience. Getting that screen up fast seemed to be the primary driving motivation, although the cost savings was also in there as well. And universally, content providers seem to have an open peering policy. So basically the Pulse peering model I described earlier. So here's the graphic showing these guys evolving from just being content providers buying transit up into peering with the tier 2 ISPs. And again, this is a significant evolution because the volume of traffic is huge. Here with these companies, we're talking in the tens of gigabits per second of traffic that used to solely go up to the tier 1 ISPs before coming down to the tier 2 ISPs or the other eyeball companies, and now it's being sent directly to the tier 2 ISPs. It's also significant because the content providers have an open peering policy. And again, interesting, the motivation is not so much the cost savings, but to improve the end user performance. And what I see is these few players, these leading players are leading the way for the other folks that are getting into it. One of the other reasons that I heard for getting into peering was we needed to move out of a bankrupt colo anyway, so why not go into an exchange point somewhere? And then the third evolution is kind of a natural fallout of the first two, which is that the cable companies peer openly with these large-scale content guys. And this is an interesting proposition in the peering ecosystem. You can get your content literally right on the network of the cable companies. In terms of performance, I mean, boom, it's right there. And this is a significant change because, again, if you think about all this traffic that used to go through the tier 1 ISPs, those pipes are shrinking quite a bit. I wouldn't bring it up except it is 10 gigabits per second for each of these guys. This is sort of the last summary slide that kind of shows one other aspect of the change, and it has to do with the peering inclinations. What we saw early on is the large content guys didn't do any peering, and they've kind of migrated into an open peering policy, the peering inclination. The tier 2 guys also started out with not a whole lot of peering and have migrated into an open peering policy. But most dramatically is once Excited Home disappeared and forced the cable companies into buying transit from the tier 1s, they too started out with no peering as a policy and migrated into the open peering policy, peering with just about anybody. More recently, we're starting to see some of the companies requiring, 5 or 10 gigabits or 5 or 10 megabits per second on 2 coasts. So these guys are kind of inching into the selective peering policies. The RBOCs are kind of, around. Companies like Bell South have taken a little while to get into the peering ecosystem, but they're getting into it now, and they tend to be more on the selective side. The tier 1 ISPs have always been on the restrictive side. Again, restrictive, we really don't need any more peering, but we are seeing them shift a little bit more towards the selective side. mostly because of the hammer of the Department of Justice over their head, making sure that they're applying their policies uniformly to everyone who comes and asks. And then the foreign ISPs, this was, again, part of the motivation for writing this white paper. A lot of times these guys would come over from another country and say, hey, we're the largest ISP in the world. We should be able to get peering with all the Tier 1 ISPs. And they go after it, and they have largely been unsuccessful. So then they shift gears and they go towards a selective peering policy, and they go and start having conversations about selling transit to the folks in the peering community. And that largely fails as well. And then finally we see them shifting into the open peering policy, where we see a large number of folks coming in from Europe and Asia, which have, generally speaking, a more open peering policy. So they'll peer with just about anybody. These are very rough categories, by the way. And with that, I have time for a couple of questions. Uh-oh.
Hi, I'm Kathy Whitbrodt. Used to once upon a time work at AtHome. Can you put the last slide back up? Because there's a couple things that this doesn't capture. There was Excite and there was AtHome. And AtHome had an open peering policy, so I don't know where the no peering comes from. The difference when AtHome went away is that instead of AtHome having an open peering policy for 25 cable providers, all of a sudden the 25 cable providers went out and got peering on their own. And I don't know what Excite did because I don't have any idea, but we peered with everybody. So I just...
Okay, the data point I got was from a couple of content guys, but it's only a couple of data points.
The Excite side and the AtHome side were really different, and the merger was a challenge. So.
Kathy, one thing I found interesting too is every time I talk to an Excite at home person, they always want to separate Excite away from at home. I never quite understood that.
Well, the problem was, you know, when you buy a company, you either merge or you don't. And when AtHome bought Excite, we didn't merge. So it was still two separate companies, functioning separately for all intents and purposes for a really long time. So there were completely different policies.
Okay, thank you. In the back, the corner there. Say your name again, Peter.
Can we have that mic?
Peter Cohen from TeliaSonera. I was wondering, Bill, if you've seen sort of the edge being pushed out for peering for new market for the business side of the relationship, such that the edge is now farther out because so much peering has basically eaten up the transit business for customers, or for networks rather, such that networks have better routing, but they've lost business on the other side of it because of all the underlying peering.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I followed the question, Peter.
Yeah, that was kind of confusing now that I think about it. Has all the peering resulted in a loss of revenue, not just because of the falling prices of dollars of transit, but also because of the peering relationships that have all come underneath all the other providers?
Yeah, you know, it's kind of an interesting point. The transit prices have dropped pretty dramatically. Just taking a survey last night, I asked folks, you know, rough numbers, how much are you paying for transit? And geez, we're talking in the $10, $20, $30 per meg now. Some folks won't, you know, admit those prices, but that's pretty substantial. And a lot of folks are taking a look and saying, does peering really make sense anymore if I can buy transit on the order of $20 or $30 a meg? And if you look at the math, the question, you know, it's not exactly clear. There's a break-even point. You can do the math and figure the cost of peering across the number of megabits per second that you send against a flat line of the transit price, and you see there's a break point where it used to be maybe 5 or 10 megabits per second, Peter. Now it's maybe closer to 50 or 60 megabits per second. And if you're buying a fast E, with that infrastructure, there's not a whole lot of growth space. So it really does come down to a trade-off question. Is it a financial motivation, or do you peer because the performance is what you're going after? And that's what we're seeing a lot more of now, the gaming companies getting into peering in a very big way. I don't know if I answered your question or talked long enough so you don't care what the answer is anymore. Go ahead.
Jeffrey Papen, formerly of Yahoo, formerly of Excite. To answer Kathy's point, Excite had no peering policy. It was 100% transit. So.
It had an open peering policy?
No, they had no
peering policy. So they did not sell transit. I'm sorry, they did not peer.
Yes.
You know, I wish I had the Star Trek music now. Da 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 da.
Bill?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Just a quick question. Paid peering, has that had any impact at all on this evolution in the last year, or do you know yet?
It's kind of slowly coming in there. You see companies like AOL that are doing, you know, paid peering, but the price point is, you know, above that which people can get transit for now. So it seems to me that what we're seeing in paid peering are people going towards that model. Again, for the performance reasons. They want to be literally right on AOL's backbone in order to get access to all those eyeballs and make the performance work out. The paid peering is still kind of a little bit rough from what I see. Mike?
Mike Hughes, large incumbent exchange point operator. This is a take on what Peter was saying earlier about the amount of peering actually taking business away from the tier ones and the falling price of transit. Just another twist on that. Could the amount of peering actually result in a drop in transit because the tier ones aren't selling as much capacity as they've built for in the first place? They were obviously projecting 3, 4, 5 years ahead and saying, well, we need to build this much infrastructure because we're going to sell this much transit, and maybe they got their math wrong, and because the amount of peering they just didn't expect to happen.
Yeah, that's a terrific.
The price down.
That's a terrific point, Mike. Absolutely. You know, the tier one guys tell me that some of the low end sellers of transit have absolutely destroyed the transit marketplace in this country. That you cannot sell transit at the prices being offered today and make any money. And it's just a matter of how long will these vendors or financiers back these companies and continue to erode this market. So there could be two different fallouts of this. One could be that transit prices go back up after the money runs out to a price that can support and sustain the continued growth. Or the other idea was doing what they're doing in New Zealand, where there's a stratification, where of course peering within a metro market and transit in a metro market to other places in the metro market is free, of course. And that in order to get to New Zealand or to London or to Frankfurt, of course there's going to be a cost associated with that, and it's going to be substantially higher than zero. So we might see a stratification in the future where tier ones that do have global coverage can in fact command $150 per meg or $250 per meg to get to the far reaches of the world. That's my take anyway.
It's almost coffee time, so I'll cut the questions off with the people currently in line.
Okay, so 1, 2, 3. 1, 2.
Microsoft, Digital Island, Exodus, Cable and Wireless, Savvis, whatever. Anyway, have you seen any pushes towards SLAs at exchange points or in peering?
I think exchange point operators do often have SLAs. Peering generally does not. Peering between two ISPs generally does not have an SLA. And I remember that was one of the sticking points with dealing with Digital Island and some of the content companies was, hey, look, I like that SLA. It gives me security. If there's a problem with my upstream, I have a stick and I hit them over the head and withhold money. Peering gives you no such guarantees. It's the aligned interests that keeps that peering connection working properly. And if it's not aligned and it's not functioning properly, then one or both parties tear it down.
Are you seeing that in like the AOL paid peering model? Are they building SLAs into that?
I don't actually know. That would be a good question for Vikas.
Sorry, can I respond to that? Which is that I've said that we offer an SLA for a service. In general, it is the people who are using our service for transit, DSL, point-to-point interconnect who care about the SLA. The people who are just using it for peering, the SLA is much less of a concern to them.
I guess my last question is, how are you seeing in your evolution large enterprises come into the fold?
Very slowly. The really big guys have been very slow to enter into this. Again, you have to kind of imagine these different categories. The content guys and the enterprise guys are, to some extent, similar in that they don't have a huge network operations staff. They don't have folks who speak BGP, and in fact, the phrase Border Gateway Protocol is very scary to them. One content company I did some work with, they have a sysadmin who does their network peering stuff if they do any network peering. It's kind of a part-time thing for him. So it's difficult for those guys to get in and convince folks that peering actually makes sense from the financial or performance point of view, but it does. I think that's the next market to come in. Yeah.
Kudos Linkage from NetNet. I used to do peering for KP Inquest. One thing I've been wondering about listening to this, and I developed a theory after KP Inquest went away, was that it appears that a lot of when KP Inquest was combined with eBay, was such a large player in Europe when it came to IP transit. When that went away, the vacuum was kind of filled a lot by the tier ones from the US coming over and trying to sell transit. At the same time, a lot of the people started buying their transit in the US, and the tier one providers who moved into Europe from the US also generally didn't pair with any of the big players in Europe. This forced a lot of the networks in Europe, at least, to go and build peering and go and join peering points like Links and M6, etc., that they didn't have to do before because they could reach all these European large networks through the European upstream, which they no longer could, and they were forced to go do this. I've been thinking of maybe this is actually kind of a mistake from the tier one side, because they're actually losing transit revenue. They have effectively forced people to go out and peer in order to keep latency down and not have to send the traffic twice across the Atlantic. This is a theory. I'm not sure this is true or not, but it's an observation I made, is that after this, a lot more people have gone out because they couldn't get to large European traffic, large European networks.
You know, it's a fascinating point. Maybe I can paraphrase it for the audience. When I was working on the follow-up to this white paper, the Asia-Pacific peering ecosystem, what I tried to do is identify what was different or counterintuitive for those folks who expanded into Asia. I know you were talking about Europe, but stay with me here. As they expanded into Asia, one of the things that I found was what I call the Tier 1 peering dynamic, the foreign Tier 1 peering dynamic. And this happens when a company, let's say like Unet, expands into Japan, and they say to the Japanese ISPs, hey, Tier 1 guys here, we're the biggest network in the world. We're Unet. We're global. We're huge. And they are. And the Tier 1s in Japan say, I'm sorry, I don't want to appear with you here, but I have no problem appearing with you on the other, in the U.S. And Unet says, no, I don't want to peer with you in the U.S. So they ultimately do not peer. And it was fascinating because Unet then becomes a Tier 2 in that ecosystem, and likewise NTT, or a better example might be Japan Telecom, comes into the U.S. and becomes Tier 2 in our ecosystem. And there are motivations and behaviors that we're able to identify as to why this happens. It turns out that the Tier 1 ISP's desire to protect their home market is far greater than any peering benefits can deliver, both financially and performance-wise. Protecting the home market is a much stronger motivation. Again, it was kind of fascinating to me because I was just looking at Asia, and this is universal, actually. Talking to folks in Europe, talking to folks in the US, yeah, absolutely. Tier 1 ISPs in any particular market they loathe to peer with anybody else, even coming in from another country where they were Tier 1.
Just a follow-up comment. When I was at KP Inquest, I know for a fact that we had US-based Tier 1 providers who wanted to peer with us. And
in Europe?
In Europe. And we were happy to peer with them, but that meant we also wanted to get US traffic and have them pay for getting traffic across the Atlantic. And they weren't too keen on doing that. It was an interesting discussion.
Yeah, again, that was the reason I wrote the white paper, was to try and identify those motivations and behaviors to kind of explain what we see. Can we take the last Tom question?
Yeah, last one real quick, and then it's coffee time.
Hey, Tom.
Question about the U.S. specifically and the ecology here. So there's lots of policy issues afoot, some of which may result in the RBOX reassuming full unilateral control over eyeballs in the United States. If something like that happens, how do you think that will affect the peering ecosystem here in the U.S.?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but the RBOX and the cable companies seem to be two different groups that control the access in.
Right, but currently because of the basically because of layer 9 factors, autonomous systems are able to interconnect all the way down to end users. Basically, the RBOX are obliged to accommodate that kind of service. So you can run an autonomous network. So basically, the addresses can be a part of an independent service provider's autonomous system rather than being a kind of a, the RBOC owns the eyeballs and then there's a peering relationship that delivers that traffic between the end network and the, say, the service provider network, which is not localized. Some of the policy issues that are in play right now could change it to that. So in effect, the RBOX could become kind of a closed system, and traffic would be actually delivered through peering with them at the edges of their network, rather than the way it currently is now. So it seems like it could possibly change the dynamic quite a lot. I just wonder if you had any time to think about that.
I'm not sure I can answer that question in a short period of time, so let me answer it quickly with a gross generalization. The cable companies, from my experience, get along extremely well with each other. Back when they were under Excited Home, they had a lot of meetings and they know each other by name. They're friends. The RBOX hate each other. The RBOX don't get along very well together. They don't play nicely. They're also in very different stages of evolution in the ecosystem. So companies like SBC have gone way into peering. Companies like Bell South are very slow into getting into the ecosystem. I think a lot of the RBOX have also kind of merged or died.
Bill, this is Ren from SBC.
Hi, Ren.
Hi. I guarantee that we peer with the other RBOX, so I'm not really sure where the perceived argument is.
It was a gross simplification. Maybe hatred is too strong a word. Hatred is a word reserved for Microsoft and the government and folks like that.
It was with Microsoft themselves and the government too.
It was more going to the point of the cooperation. I'm sorry, I should have stated it more positively. The cable companies are very cooperative with each other, very helpful with each other. I don't see that kind of cooperation among the RBOX, but it could also be.
I disagree here as well.
Okay.
Even yesterday, we were on conference calls with one of the RBOX to make sure that we had standardized maintenance notifications built into our ticketing.
Okay. I think I'm getting the hook, so I better. If you guys want any more information about this stuff, I've got 5 or 6 copies of the white paper, and feel free to grab a copy. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill.